Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review, of course from the 1.41 selection, and this one has been a very highly requested car to review for obvious reasons. It's a very controversial vehicle, probably the single most controversial one of the pack, handily, and of course it became controversial as soon as we saw the category that it was in, and there was a lot of speculation beforehand. I was sure that it would be in Group 4, I said as much. There was the possibility of Group X, which is always a possibility with polyphony, and there was the remote chance, a very remote chance many of us considered, certainly I did, that it could be in some other category, because what else would make sense? They're not going to put it in the N classes, it's a race car. Well, they did. It's in the N classes, it's in N200, and that makes about as much sense as the BMW i3 being in Group X purely because it's electric. That's ridiculous, it can't even beat a Samba bus. Who cares if it's electric? Likewise with this, it does not belong in N200. Because one of the things that people seem to be forgetting is that these classes are not about how fast a car is. That has never been the point of these classes. The point of the classes is like versus like. This is not a street car. It never has been, it never will be. It literally has touring car in the name. So there is no place for this car in the N categories. It's ridiculous that it's even in there, and it makes even less sense than stuff like the i3 being in Group X or the Aston Martin Vulcan being in N800. That's ridiculous enough, but at least that's close to a street car because it's not a race car either. This is a pure race car and was always treated as such. Now, for some weird arbitrary reason, it's in N200. But here's the strange thing, it makes even less sense in N200 when you actually drive the thing, because it can be easily beaten by loads of them. You can detune it to N100, and again, the opponents wipe the floor with it. K cars can beat this thing in N100, but at the same time you're probably thinking, well, surely that proves the point. If those cars can beat it, that's where it belongs. You would never want it up against race cars if it can't even beat road cars. But that's the funny thing, and it's one of the biggest flaws about the Gran Turismo Sport class system, and that is that it doesn't work like that. As I said, it's not based on performance, it's based arbitrarily on like versus like, and the street cars, power versus power, which I've discussed before being absolutely ridiculous. It's essentially a game where the Jay Leno tank car would, in the N classes, occupy the same category as a LaFerrari, because of course that makes sense. No. Now obviously something like that would probably be in Group X, but you get the point. And even in the ones that are in the game, they still don't make sense. In what universe should a Charger Hellcat be in the same category as a Pagani Huayra? That's simply not fair, and it never will be. So having this vehicle in N200 is not about whether or not it can compete or whether it's OP. Ironically enough, it's actually the opposite. It's slower, if anything. So why am I saying, and why am I sticking to my original argument that this should have and still should be in Group 4? Well, the reason why is very simple. N200 cars can beat Group 4 cars anyway, so talking pure power is it's just a pointless argument. It's a straw man argument, because those cars simply do not follow the same rules of racing. They will have less downforce, longer gearing, they can be much lighter sometimes than the Group 4 regulations will allow, and their top speeds are more often than not higher. You put something like a Group 2 NSX, detuned even for N200, or yeah, N200 I should say, not Group 2, up against a Group 4 Megane, for instance, the NSX is going to wipe the floor with that Megane in a straight line. Through corners, not so much, but that's the thing again. This Mazda is not a straight line car, so how on earth is it supposed to compete with street vehicles when Group 4 is its natural rivalry? They literally have everything in common in terms of how they actually perform. They're based on cornering ability and grip, not particularly good acceleration, and even less impressive top speed, with a lot of mandatory downforce and a complete bias toward balance of performance being applied. Everything I just said applies to both the Mazda and all of the Group 4 cars. Now, at the same time, some people have made the argument that, well, the power isn't high enough, even with the weight advantage, so if you were to BOP the power up, to buff it up, in effect, well then the weight would be way too low and it would beat them all easily. Not really. because balance of performance is completely arbitrary, so they can make it weigh whatever they want it to weigh. So no, it's not going to be OP at all. Just think of what they've already done, especially in the beta stage of the game on tracks like Blue Moon Bay. If you take a Group 3 car into a balance of performance event on, for instance, Blue Moon Bay, and I don't recall the last time they've done this, but they certainly used to, plenty of times, the balance of performance would adjust the power of whatever Group 3 car you were in to about 800 horsepower. Why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because you cannot get 800 horsepower out of those cars. So at the same time, they could easily do that with the weight of the vehicle here. Just make it 320 horsepower or something, and add literally 400 or 500 kilos to the weight, and boom, you're immediately in Group 4 territory. Everyone's happy. And the fact that this car can compete even with far less power has already been proven even since the day the update dropped by, for instance, people in the community spotlight, various people in messages and comments and lobbies. People have tested this against Group 4s because it's the most obvious thing to do, and it can compete. Even though fully tuned it's got nowhere near the power, it can still beat them. Even if you add a ton of ballast, add it to, well over 1,000 kilos or whatever, it can still beat them. So, to me, it just makes no sense why this car would ever be an N200. So as far as I'm concerned, this car definitely should be controversial. It makes very little sense, and it's a shame that that is the majority of the discussion, because as far as a car on its own goes, it's really good. The handling is fantastic, it looks good, it sounds good, tons of great liveries out there already, the cornering speeds are also very impressive because it's so light and you don't have a huge amount of power to put down. It's a brilliant vehicle across the board, 205 horsepower, less than 800 kilos. It even puts out 258 horsepower per tonne, which is very respectable for what the starting power is, and 80,000 credits, it's one of the cheapest race cars in the game. Now, it's far from being the only vehicle that suffers from these issues, but it's certainly one that stands out a lot, and of course part of that is because it's so recent. Now, ultimately, you could argue that this discussion is somewhat pointless, and that is essentially true. But just because you don't believe a conversation will accomplish what you want it to, doesn't mean that the conversation shouldn't be at least had. So I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. There are certainly people on both sides of this. I understand the people who think that it shouldn't be in Group 4, but to me, balance of performance just destroys that argument because it's so arbitrary to begin with. They can literally give the cars whatever specs they want and just work from there. So that's it as far as my thoughts. It's a great car, and it's certainly a very useful one in the N classes. But to me, the discussion is about more than just whether or not you can use it to earn money, which incidentally you can. It's about just being fair and putting cars in categories that make sense, and this car simply doesn't. So overall, that's it for my review. Of course, check out my cash earning tune for the car, putting it up against Group 4s, somewhat ironically if you want to. And that's it for this vid, so of course I'll see you next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.